The morning of June 19th, 1944, began with routine tension for Lieutenant Takeo Tanimizu of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He pulled himself into the cramped cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M50, settling into leather worn smooth by months of combat sorties over the Pacific. The air above the Philippine Sea hung thick with humidity, but Tanimizu knew that at altitude where the real fighting happened, it would be different, crystal clear. The kind of environment where the Zero had always excelled, where Japanese naval aviators had built their legend in the opening years of the war. Tanimizu's hands moved through the pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency. Fuel mixture, propeller pitch, magnetos, trim tabs. Every switch, every lever held meaning forged through 2 years of combat experience. He understood this aircraft intimately, every vibration transmitted through the control stick, every subtle response in the rudder pedals, the precise angle of attack where the wings would bite into thin air and carry him higher than any American fighter could follow. Or so he had been taught. Or so he had believed, through dozens of successful combat missions over the Solomons, over Rabaul, over New Guinea. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Zero had made Tanimizu dangerous. It had made all of them dangerous. In the early months following Pearl Harbor, American pilots had learned through blood and burning wreckage, never turn with a Zero. The Mitsubishi fighter could outturn anything the Americans fielded. It was lighter, more responsive, capable of pivoting inside any American fighter's turning circle and bringing its 20mm cannon to bear while the enemy was still struggling through his arc. This advantage had become more than tactical doctrine. It had become identity, the foundation of Japanese naval aviation's self-conception as an elite force. Japanese training emphasized the turning fight with religious fervor. Get close, force the horizontal engagement, wait for your opponent to make the inevitable fatal mistake of trying to match your turn rate. Tanimizu had seen it work repeatedly. American Grumman F4F Wildcats attempted to turn with Zeros, bleeding energy with each degree of bank, becoming progressively slower targets until Japanese guns found them. The tactic was so reliable it had bred a dangerous confidence throughout the Japanese naval air arm. But intelligence reports over the preceding months had mentioned a new American fighter entering service in increasing numbers. The F6F Hellcat. Pilots who had encountered it and survived, and the survivors were becoming fewer, brought back troubling accounts. The new fighter was faster than the Zero, more heavily armored, able to absorb punishment that would shred a Zero's deliberately lightweight airframe. Yet those returning pilots had followed established doctrine. They had attempted to force turning engagements where the Zero's superiority should have manifested decisively. Some had succeeded. Most had not returned to file reports. What Tanimizu did not know, what none of them yet fully comprehended, was that the Americans had fundamentally changed their approach to air combat. They had stopped trying to beat the Zero at its own game. They had changed the rules of engagement entirely. The Grumman F6F Hellcat represented a complete philosophical departure in fighter design. Where the Zero sacrificed nearly everything for horizontal maneuverability, eliminating armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, structural reinforcement, the Hellcat was constructed around a single massive component that defined its entire combat capability, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine. This 18-cylinder radial power plant produced 2,000 horsepower at takeoff, nearly double the output of the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine's 1,130 horsepower. That raw power differential translated into performance characteristics that would fundamentally rewrite the doctrine of fighter combat in the Pacific. The Hellcat could climb at 3,500 feet per minute at its optimal altitude. The Zero's maximum climb rate reached 2,750 feet per minute, and that figure assumed the lightest possible configuration, no external fuel tanks, reduced ammunition load, no combat maneuvering. In actual combat conditions, with full fuel and ammunition, After any energy-depleting maneuvers, the gap widened considerably. The Hellcat also possessed a crucial advantage in terminal dive velocity, capable of reaching 415 miles per hour in a sustained dive without structural failure or loss of control, while the Zero's deliberately lightweight construction limited it to approximately 360 miles per hour before control surfaces became dangerously unresponsive or before structural integrity was compromised. These performance specifications enabled a tactical approach that American naval aviators had been developing and refining systematically since late 1943. The evolution built upon earlier innovations like the Thach weave, but had matured into something more fundamental: pure vertical fighting. Instead of attempting to turn with the Zero in the horizontal plane where Japanese advantages were decisive, Hellcat pilots would use their superior horsepower and structural strength to control every engagement from the vertical dimension. The tactic was brutally simple in concept: dive on a Zero from altitude, execute a single high-speed firing pass, and if the opportunity was not immediately decisive, convert accumulated velocity into a zoom climb back to altitude rising faster than the Zero could possibly follow, resetting the engagement with renewed altitude advantage. For a Zero pilot attempting to counter this vertical assault, the experience proved psychologically devastating. You could see the American fighter. You could track it visually through its dive. You could even maneuver to attempt interception. But when you tried to follow the Hellcat back up into the vertical plane, your Zero would climb gamely for several seconds, then lose the energy race. The nose would drop as airspeed bled away. Your controls would soften. Meanwhile, the Hellcat would continue rising impossibly, effortlessly, until it was positioned above you again, in position to dive again, in position to kill you at leisure. Tanemizu would learn this tactical reality personally in the coming hours. He would learn it alongside hundreds of other Japanese pilots during what American naval aviators would later call, with dark humor, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a battle that would demonstrate with clinical brutality that Japanese air combat doctrine had become catastrophically obsolete. As Tanemizu completed his pre-flight checks that morning, he registered the unusual concentration of aircraft being prepared for launch across the Japanese carrier fleet. Nearly 400 fighters and bombers were being readied simultaneously, a massive strike package representing one of the largest carrier operations the Imperial Japanese Navy had mounted since Midway 2 years prior. The operational plan was ambitious, perhaps desperately so. The strike would launch from beyond the range of American carrier-based fighters, hit the American invasion forces supporting the Saipan landings, then recover at Guam's airfields to refuel before striking the American carrier fleet on the return flight. The plan required precise coordination across hundreds of aircraft. It demanded exact timing, and it rested on a foundational assumption that Japanese fighters could still achieve local air superiority against American opposition when the engagement was properly structured. That assumption was about to undergo catastrophic testing against the largest concentration of F6F Hellcats ever assembled in a single battle space. The Japanese had no accurate intelligence on just how many Hellcats the Americans could launch. Task Force 58, the American fast carrier task force operating in support of the Marianas invasion, had been reinforced specifically for this operation. 15 fleet carriers and light carriers, operating in 4 task groups spread across miles of ocean, carried more than 900 aircraft. Of those 900 aircraft, over 450 were F6F Hellcats. The Japanese strike force of 373 aircraft would be facing numerical superiority in fighters alone, before accounting for the Hellcats' tactical and performance advantages. But numbers told only part of the story. The more significant factor was the maturation of American tactical doctrine and the systematic training program that had inculcated that doctrine into hundreds of naval aviators. By June 1944, American carrier air groups had been operating Hellcats for more than a year. Pilots had accumulated hundreds of combat hours. Squadron commanders had refined their tactics through actual combat experience. The tactical manuals had been rewritten based on what worked and what killed pilots. The result was a force that understood how to exploit the Hellcat's advantages with systematic precision. The first radar contacts appeared on American Combat Information Center screens at 1000 hours local time. Operators tracking the Japanese raid watched as the formation resolved into distinct groups, bombers with fighter escorts, approaching from the west in a massive wave. On the carriers USS Lexington, Enterprise, Bunker Hill, and a dozen others, the alert order crackled across flight deck loudspeakers in the distinctive cadence that every naval aviator recognized. Pilots, man your planes. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer climbed into his F6F Hellcat aboard USS Essex, his movements efficient despite the Florida heat trapped in his flight suit. He had been flying Hellcats since February, transitioning from the older F4F Wildcat, and the performance difference continued to impress him each time he strapped into the cockpit. The Hellcat was substantially heavier, over 12,000 pounds at combat-loaded weight, compared to the Zero's 6,000 pounds, but that mass came with advantages that translated directly into survivability and lethality. The cockpit was armoured, steel plates behind the seat and headrest, bulletproof glass in the windscreen. The fuel tanks incorporated self-sealing technology that could contain hits from 20mm cannon rounds. The 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing, carried 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 rounds of ammunition, compared to the Zero's lighter armament of 2 20mm cannon with just 60 rounds each, supplemented by 2 lighter 7.7mm machine guns. And most crucially, the massive R2800 engine mounted ahead of the firewall gave Brewer options that Wildcat pilots had never possessed. Options that would define how he fought. Brewer had studied the intelligence reports on the Zero extensively. He had listened carefully to the veterans who had survived the early months of the Pacific War when Zeros had dominated American forces. He understood intellectually and viscerally the lethal danger of the turning fight against that aircraft. But he also understood that American pilots no longer fought that way. The doctrine had evolved. It had been refined through loss and victory into something simple, almost brutal in its clarity. Speed is life. Altitude is life insurance. Never slow down in combat. Never allow yourself to be drawn into a sustained turning engagement. Use your power advantage and your structural strength advantage. Fight exclusively in the vertical plane where American advantages were maximized. The tactical briefing that morning had been concise. Japanese strike inbound, massive raid, expect heavy fighter opposition. Mission: destroy the Japanese strike before it reaches the task force. Rules of engagement: standard vertical fighting doctrine, maintain division integrity, do not pursue damaged aircraft below 10,000 feet. The brevity reflected confidence built on a year of increasingly one-sided combat results. The launch sequence began at 10:20 hours. Hellcats rolled down flight decks, their powerful engines pulling them into the air with authority. Within 20 minutes, over 450 American fighters were airborne, forming a layered defensive barrier between the approaching Japanese formation and the American carriers. The fighter direction officers aboard the carriers were coordinating the interception with a sophistication that would have been impossible, even a year earlier. Radar gave precise range and bearing to the threat. Radio communications allowed real-time tactical control. The system was mature, tested, and effective. The Japanese, meanwhile, approached formations optimized for mutual support in horizontal combat. Tight groupings where each pilot could cover his wingman's turn, where numerical concentration could overwhelm isolated defenders. The formation discipline was excellent testimony to Japanese training and professionalism, but it was the wrong kind of discipline for the combat environment they were about to enter. Against vertical fighting tactics, those tight formations simply meant more targets concentrated in the kill zone when American fighters dove through them. Lieutenant Tanemizu flew in the escort group, his zero part of a formation assigned to protect the Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers below. At this distance, he could see American fighters climbing to intercept, but he could not yet identify the Gobel, a Pacific type. The formations looked disciplined, professional. The Americans had improved considerably since the early days of the war, but professionalism could not overcome the Zero's inherent advantages in the turning fight. That confidence, built on dozens of successful combats, reinforced by training and doctrine, remained unshaken as the range closed. That confidence would last precisely until the moment of first contact. The Hellcats did not circle looking for advantageous positioning. They did not attempt to maneuver for a traditional horizontal engagement. Instead, they executed exactly what their training and doctrine prescribed. They came down from altitude in coordinated divisions, diving through the Japanese formation at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. The first pass tore through the Japanese bomber formation with devastating effect. 50 caliber tracers, 6 streams per fighter, 400 rounds per minute per gun stitched through unarmored fuel, tanks and cockpit canopies. 2 Kate bombers exploded immediately, their torpedo loads detonating in orange fireballs. A third began trailing thick black smoke, falling away from the formation in a descending spiral. Tanemizu reacted instinctively, rolling his Zero into the kind of aggressive turn that should have positioned him perfectly on an attacking fighter's tail. He pulled hard on the control stick, the Zero responding with the immediate precision that had saved his life in previous combats. The turn tightened progressively. 4 G-forces, 5 G-forces. The Zero's light wing loading allowed sustained high G turns that would force heavier aircraft to either reduce their turn rate or risk accelerated stall. Below and ahead, Tanemizu could see one of the American fighters larger than a Wildcat, painted in darker blue, pulling out of its attack dive. Tanemizu continued his turn, leading the target, his finger resting on the firing button, waiting for the American pilot to make his mistake, waiting for the inevitable moment when the American would try to turn with him and lose the energy race. The American did not turn to engage in the horizontal plane. Instead, the Hellcat pilot shoved his throttle to the forward stop and pulled into a steep climbing turn. Not a level turn where the Zero's maneuverability would dominate decisively, but a climbing spiral that deliberately traded turning radius for altitude gain, exchanging the horizontal advantage for the vertical dimension where different performance characteristics mattered. Tanemizu followed without conscious thought, years of training and combat experience dictating his response. He pulled his nose up to track the climbing American fighter. For several seconds his Zero climbed well, the Sakai engine responding cleanly to his throttle input. But the Hellcat was climbing faster, not marginally faster, dramatically, impossibly faster. The American fighter was pulling away vertically, rising at a rate that seemed to violate everything Tanemizu understood about fighter performance. He pulled harder, attempting to keep his gun sight reticle on the target, but his Zero was decelerating. The airspeed indicator unwound steadily 220 knots, 200, 180. The control stick was becoming mushy in his hands. The climb angle was unsustainable without stalling. The Hellcat continued climbing away from him. Tanemizu faced a choice with immediate life-or-death implications. He could continue pulling up, bleeding additional energy, until his Zero stalled and became a stationary target suspended in the air. Or he could push over, maintain airspeed, and disengage from this particular combat. He pushed over, recovering his airspeed as the nose dropped below the horizon. By the time he had regained sufficient energy and looked for the American fighter, it had vanished somewhere above him, invisible in the sun glare, perfectly positioned to dive again at its leisure. This identical scenario was occurring simultaneously across dozens of individual combats throughout the airspace over the Philippine Sea. Japanese pilots, whose entire tactical understanding had been built around horizontal turning combat, were discovering that American pilots would not turn with them under any circumstances. The Hellcats would dive through Japanese formations, fire accurate bursts from their heavy machine guns, then climb away before the Zeros could bring their superior turning ability to bear. When Japanese pilots attempted to follow them into the vertical plane, their lighter aircraft lost the energy race every time. The power differential was simply too great to overcome through pilot skill or tactical cleverness. Commander David McCampbell, leading the Essex Fighter Group, had positioned his division at 23,000 feet, well above the Japanese formation's altitude. From this commanding position, he could observe the entire battle developing below with tactical clarity. The Japanese maintained their formation discipline admirably, but it was optimized for the wrong combat geometry. They were flying in tight formations designed for mutual support in horizontal engagements. Against vertical fighting tactics employed by aircraft with superior power-to-weight ratios, those formations simply meant more aircraft exposed during each American diving pass. McCampbell selected his target with the calculation of a predator, a Zero, slightly separated from the main formation, its pilot apparently focused on aircraft below. He rolled inverted and pulled into a dive, his Hellcat accelerating smoothly as the big radial engine pulled him faster through increasingly dense air. At 400 miles per hour indicated airspeed, with perfect deflection calculated instinctively through hundreds of practice runs, McCampbell centered the Zero in his illuminated gun sight and pressed the firing button. 6 50 caliber machine guns converged their fire on the Zero's wing root, the lightweight structure designed deliberately without armor or redundant structural members to save weight disintegrated under the impact. The Zero rolled inverted and began falling, trailing pieces of wing structure and control surface. McCampbell did not watch it fall. That was a luxury for combat footage, not for survival. He pulled back firmly on the control stick, converting his accumulated dive velocity back into potential energy through a zoom climb. His Hellcat rose cleanly, the R2800 engine effortlessly converting speed back into altitude. At 25,000 feet, he possessed both altitude and energy advantage again. Below him, 2 Zeros had turned in his direction, attempting to intercept, but they were 4,000 feet below, unable to reach him before he could reposition or dive again. This represented the fundamental tactical revolution the Hellcat enabled. The aircraft itself was not necessarily better than Zero in some abstract engineering sense. It was heavier, less maneuverable in level flight, and consumed more fuel. But it was decisively superior in the dimensions of combat that actually determined survival and victory in 1944. It made horizontal maneuverability the Zero's core advantage strategically irrelevant by refusing to fight in the horizontal plane. The Hellcat transformed air combat into a three-dimensional chess game where altitude and energy management mattered infinitely more than turning radius. Japanese pilots, trained exclusively in two-dimensional dogfighting, found themselves fighting a form of combat they had never adequately prepared for, and could not win with their current equipment. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By 11:15 hours, the carefully structured Japanese strike force had dissolved into chaos. What had begun as a coordinated attack formation, bombers protected by fighter escorts, approach vectors calculated, timing synchronized, had degraded into individual survival struggles scattered across hundreds of square miles of airspace. Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers, stripped of their fighter protection, were being systematically destroyed by roving Hellcat divisions. Aichi Val dive bombers attempting to reach the American fleet found themselves intercepted at altitude by fighters they could neither outrun nor outmaneuver. Zeros that attempted to defend them discovered they could not catch diving Hellcats or outclimb them when the American fighters converted their speed back into altitude. The few instances where Japanese pilots successfully forced traditional turning engagements revealed another dimension of the Hellcat's superiority. The American fighter could absorb battle damage that would be instantly fatal to a Zero. The heavy armor plating, the self-sealing fuel tanks, the robust radial engine that could continue running with cylinders shot away. These survival features meant Hellcats could survive hits that would down lighter aircraft. Japanese pilots who managed to get guns on target, who executed perfect deflection shots, watched their rounds strike home only to see the Hellcat continue fighting. The psychological impact was corrosive. Even when you did everything correctly, the enemy survived and killed you. Lieutenant Tanemizu attempted 3 more interceptions during the following 20 minutes. Each engagement followed the same frustrating pattern. He would maneuver aggressively to engage, positioning his Zero for what should have been an advantageous firing opportunity. The American fighter would either dive away using superior speed or climb away using superior power-to-weight ratio. Twice he managed to fire at extreme range, his 20mm cannon shells arcing through the space where the American fighter had been milliseconds earlier. His lighter 7.7mm machine guns, effective only at close-range range he could not achieve against an opponent who controlled the engagement geometry completely, remained largely silent. The third interception attempt nearly killed him. He had positioned himself skillfully, climbing to altitude slightly above a pair of Hellcats that appeared to be reforming after an attack run. This was the textbook approach: gain altitude advantage, use gravity to accelerate in the dive, compensate for the Zero's lower maximum speed through careful positioning. Tanemizu rolled inverted and pulled into his attack dive, building speed carefully, his deflection angle calculated correctly. As his finger tightened on the firing button, one of the Hellcats broke hard and pulled straight up into a pure vertical climb, not a climbing turn, but a 90-degree vertical ascent that seemed to defy aerodynamics. Tanemizu's momentum carried him past the other Hellcat, which immediately reversed hard and dove on his position. He felt the impacts before his brain processed what was happening. Heavy 50 caliber rounds, each projectile weighing nearly 2 ounces, traveling at 2,800 feet per second, punched through his Zero's unarmored fuselage. One round severed the hydraulic line feeding his right aileron actuator. Another round shattered the canopy frame inches from his head, filling the cockpit with razor fragments of plexiglass. A third round struck the armor plate behind his seat, the only armor the Zero possessed, and ricocheted through the radio equipment. Tanemizu reacted with pure survival instinct. He pushed hard right rudder, skidding his Zero violently sideways to disrupt the American pilot's tracking solution. The maneuver was desperate, energy-wasting, but it threw off the Hellcat's aim for the critical 2 seconds Tanemizu needed. He rolled inverted and dove for the cloud layer 4,000 feet below, accepting the vulnerability of the dive to escape the immediate threat of destruction. The Hellcat did not follow him down. There was no tactical need. The American pilot had other targets at altitude, and Tanemizu's damaged Zero was effectively removed from combat. Tanemizu nursed his crippled fighter toward the Japanese carrier fleet, trailing thin streams of hydraulic fluid that evaporated in the slipstream. His right aileron responded sluggishly. His radio was dead. But he was alive, and in the next hours, that would prove more than most of his fellow pilots could claim. As he flew, alone now, separated from his formation, Tanemizu processed what he had experienced. He had been flying Zeros for 2 years. He had survived dozens of combat missions over the Solomons, over Rabaul, over New Guinea. He had shot down American fighters, Wildcats primarily, slower and less capable than his Zero. He understood air combat. He was a skilled pilot by any measure. But in this engagement, he had been comprehensively outclassed, not necessarily by superior individual piloting skill, though the American pilots were clearly competent, but by an aircraft and tactics combination that rendered his skills and his aircraft's traditional strengths strategically irrelevant. The battle continued without him. The second wave of Japanese aircraft, launched in the early afternoon, fared even worse than the first. American fighter direction had refined its interception tactics based on the morning's engagement. Hellcats were vectored to intercept the Japanese formations at even greater distances from the fleet. The Japanese pilots faced the same vertical fighting tactics, the same impossible climb rates, the same devastating diving attacks. Of 109 aircraft launched in the second strike, only 31 would return to their carriers. The kill ratio was approaching catastrophic levels. By 1800 hours, when the last surviving Japanese aircraft were recovering aboard their carriers or attempting emergency landings at Guam, the statistical reality was undeniable. The Imperial Japanese Navy had launched 373 aircraft in the day's strikes. Approximately 130 returned. Of the 243 aircraft lost, approximately 220 had been shot down by American fighters, the vast majority by F6F Hellcats. American losses totaled 29 aircraft in air-to-air combat. The kill ratio 8 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every American fighter lost represented more than numerical superiority. It represented tactical and technological obsolescence. The human cost extended beyond aircraft losses. Each downed aircraft typically meant a dead or captured pilot. Japan's pilot training program, already strained by losses over the preceding 2 years, could not replace experienced aviators at anything approaching the rate they were being killed. The United States, meanwhile, was graduating thousands of pilots annually from training, programs that had been systematically expanded since 1941. American pilot training lasted 18 months on average and included hundreds of hours of flight time. Japanese pilot training by mid-1944 had been reduced to 6 months with minimal flight hours due to fuel shortages and training aircraft attrition. The Battle of the Philippine Sea continued into a second day, but the aerial combat component was effectively decided in those first hours of June 19th. American submarines sank 2 Japanese carriers during the night. American carrier aircraft struck the Japanese fleet on June 20th, sinking another carrier and damaging several others. But the decisive action was the destruction of Japanese naval aviation's combat capability in those morning hours when Hellcats demonstrated that Japanese tactical doctrine was no longer viable. In the weeks following the Philippine Sea engagement, surviving Japanese pilots filed after-action reports that painted a remarkably consistent picture. These reports, preserved in Japanese naval archives and later analyzed by American intelligence officers, reveal the moment when doctrinal confidence collapsed into desperate awareness of technological and tactical inadequacy. Lieutenant Commander Zenji Abe, a veteran pilot and training instructor who survived the battle, wrote in his official report, "Enemy fighters demonstrate superior high-speed performance and climbing ability that exceeds our intelligence estimates. Attempts to engage in traditional turning combat prove ineffective. Enemy aircraft dive from altitude, execute a single attacking pass with heavy firepower, then climb beyond our aircraft's ability to follow. Our fighters cannot maintain energy in vertical maneuvering. Recommend urgent tactical review." Another report, filed by the commander of the 601st Naval Air Group, was more direct in its assessment. F6F type fighters demonstrated climb rate approximately 30% superior to 0 in combat conditions. In vertical combat, our aircraft is at complete and decisive disadvantage. Strongly recommend avoiding vertical engagement with F6F type aircraft. Traditional horizontal fighting doctrine is not effective against this enemy. The tactical implications were profound and deeply troubling for Japanese naval aviation. Their entire combat doctrine had been constructed around the Zero's strengths: superior maneuverability in horizontal flight, excellent operational range, allowing strikes at extended distances, lightweight permitting operation from carriers with limited catapult capability. These advantages had defined Japanese naval aviation's identity and success in the war's opening phase. Now American fighters had systematically negated those advantages by refusing to fight in the horizontal plane where Japanese strengths mattered. The official tactical directive issued in July 1944 to all Japanese naval air units represented a remarkable admission of obsolescence. The directive, translated from the original Japanese, stated, "When engaging F6F type aircraft, pilots must not attempt to follow enemy aircraft in vertical climbs. Enemy aircraft possess superior power-to-weight ratio in combat conditions and will achieve a dominant position. Engage only when substantial positional advantage exists. Avoid combat when enemy aircraft have altitude advantage greater than 1,000 meters. Do not pursue enemy aircraft in dives beyond safe structural limits. Reduced to its essential meaning, never fight vertical against the Hellcat. Avoid engagement unless you possess overwhelming advantage. Disengage when the enemy has altitude superiority." This directive represented the functional collapse of Japanese fighter doctrine. For nearly 3 years, Japanese naval aviators had been trained to seek engagement aggressively, to use their superior turning ability to dominate close-range dogfights, to close with American aircraft and destroy them through superior maneuverability. Now they were being instructed to avoid engagement unless conditions were nearly perfect conditions that competent American fighter pilots would never allow to develop. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was substantial and corrosive. Tanemizu survived the war, eventually being reassigned to training duties in Japan after his Zero was destroyed in combat over Iwo Jima in February 1945. In post-war interviews conducted during the occupation period, he described the transformation in pilot morale. "After the Philippine Sea, we knew. When we saw Hellcats, we understood we could not win unless we possessed every advantage: altitude, position, surprise, numerical superiority. Even with all those advantages, if the American pilot was skilled and followed his doctrine, he could escape using his aircraft's speed and climb rate. We were taught the Zero was superior to all American fighters. We learned this was no longer true in the combat that mattered in 1944. The technical specifications supported this psychological assessment. The F6F Hellcat that fought at Philippine Sea possessed a power-to-weight ratio of 0.17 horsepower per pound at combat weight. The A6M50's power-to-weight ratio was 0.19 horsepower per pound, actually slightly superior on paper. This apparent numerical advantage for the Zero was misleading in actual combat conditions. The calculation did not account for the Hellcat's superior high-altitude performance, where its two-stage supercharged engine maintained power output, while the Zero's single-stage supercharger lost effectiveness. It did not account for the Hellcat's structural strength that allowed sustained high-speed maneuvers and dives that would risk structural failure in the Zero's lightweight airframe. Most crucially, it did not account for how those specifications translated into practical combat capability in three-dimensional fighting. The Zero could theoretically outclimb the Hellcat under extremely specific conditions at sea level, in a sustained climb with no maneuvering, with minimum fuel load. But combat never occurred under those laboratory conditions. Combat happened at varying altitudes after energy-depleting maneuvers, with fuel tanks at different states, with pilots executing violent evasive actions. In those real-world conditions, the Hellcat's superior engine power and structural robustness translated into practical combat superiority that statistics alone could not capture. American pilots understood these advantages and exploited them with systematic ruthlessness. The Fighter Tactics Manual, distributed to F6F squadrons in early 1944, explicitly outlined vertical fighting doctrine with remarkable clarity. The F6F possesses superior diving and climbing speed compared to all known enemy fighters. Use this advantage to control at every engagement. Attack from altitude advantage, execute one high-speed pass, extend and climb. Do not attempt to dogfight with enemy aircraft in horizontal plane under any circumstances. Maintain indicated airspeed above 250 knots at all times in combat areas. If attacked from superior position, turn into attack and immediately zoom. Climb your superior power will carry you above the attacker if you maintain energy discipline. This doctrine was not merely distributed and filed. It was taught systematically, practiced repeatedly, and executed with remarkable consistency across American carrier air groups. Pilots drilled these tactics until they became instinctive. They learned to fight as divisions, with one pair engaging while the other pair maintained altitude advantage as covering force. They learned to use cloud formations and sun position to mask their climbing reversals. They learned to calculate energy states almost instinctively, understanding when they possessed sufficient speed to zoom climb, when they needed to extend away and rebuild energy before re-engaging. Japanese pilots, meanwhile, continued flying an aircraft optimized for a different kind of war. The Zero's lightweight construction, its exceptional turning ability, its remarkable operational range, these characteristics had been optimized for the war Japan had planned to fight in 1941, a war of aggressive expansion across the Pacific, of carrier strikes at extended range, of air superiority achieved through superior pilot skill and superior maneuverability in individual combat. By mid-1944, that war had evolved into something fundamentally different, and the Zero's design characteristics were increasingly liabilities rather than advantages. The evolution of carrier warfare by late 1944 added additional dimensions to this tactical revolution. American carrier task forces operated with massive fighter complements that Japanese planners in 1941 could not have imagined. Task Force 38, operating in support of the Philippines campaign in October 1944, deployed over 1,000 fighters, the vast majority being F6F Hellcats with a smaller number of the newer F4U Corsairs. These fighters operated in layered defensive systems, combat air patrol at 25,000 feet, ready aircraft spotted on carrier decks for immediate launch, and reserve aircraft that could be launched within 15 minutes of alert. Japanese carriers, by contrast, struggled to maintain even minimal air wings. The losses at Philippine Sea had effectively destroyed the experienced pilot corps that had begun the war. Replacement pilots received drastically abbreviated training as little as 6 months compared to the 2 years of intensive training pre-war pilots had completed. These hastily trained pilots learned basic flying skills and rudimentary gunnery, but they lacked the experience to execute complex tactics or to adapt when their prescribed doctrine failed against superior opposition. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 demonstrated the cumulative effect of this disparity with brutal clarity. The Japanese Northern Force carriers served essentially as decoys, carrying just 116 aircraft total intended to draw American carriers away from the invasion beaches at Leyte. When American fighters located these carriers on October 25th, the resulting air combat was catastrophically one-sided. Japanese pilots flying Zeros attempted to defend their carriers using traditional horizontal fighting tactics. Hellcat pilots methodically destroyed them using vertical fighting techniques that Japanese pilots still could not effectively counter, despite 4 months to develop responses. Lieutenant Junior Grade Eugene Valencia, flying from USS Lexington, achieved 6 confirmed victories in a single engagement during the Leyte Gulf action. His tactical approach exemplified the systematic application of vertical fighting doctrine. Position his division above the Japanese combat air patrol, dive through the formation at maximum speed, zoom climb back to altitude using the Hellcat's superior power, repeat the sequence until ammunition was exhausted or all targets were destroyed. Valencia later described the engagement in his after-action report. The combat was almost mechanical in execution. The enemy aircraft could not touch us provided we maintained energy discipline and kept our speed up. Their attempts to engage us in turning combat were completely ineffective. The final evolution of this tactical revolution came with the introduction of the F6F5 variant in early 1945. This improved Hellcat featured a more powerful R2800 engine, producing 2,200 horsepower, enhanced armor protection, and improved high-altitude performance characteristics. This aircraft could climb at 3,650 feet per minute, under optimal conditions, an even more dominant vertical performance that made the Zero completely obsolete in air-to-air combat. Against this improved Hellcat, Japanese fighters could achieve victory only through numerical superiority, combined with complete surprise conditions that competent American combat air patrol made nearly impossible to achieve. By the Okinawa campaign beginning in April 1945, Japanese tactical doctrine had undergone its final evolution, or more accurately, its complete abandonment. Conventional aerial combat had proven unwinnable against American numerical superiority, combined with technical and tactical advantages. The response was the organized kamikaze attacks converting aircraft into guided weapons, where pilot skill mattered less than determination to reach the target. The kamikaze represented the ultimate admission that Japanese fighters could no longer compete with American fighters in air-to-air combat. Rather than send pilots into combats, they had minimal chance of surviving while achieving minimal damage to American forces. Japanese commanders chose to guarantee at least some damage through deliberate suicide attacks. The Hellcat's combat record through the war's conclusion was statistically overwhelming. F6F Hellcats were credited with 5,223 air combat victories while operating from carriers, plus additional victories scored from land bases. This represented approximately 56% of all American aerial victories in the Pacific theater. The Hellcat's kill ratio in air-to-air combat reached approximately 19 to 119, Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Hellcat lost in air combat. These numbers reflected not merely technical superiority in isolation, but the tactical revolution that superior power and structural strength enabled. The broader strategic implications extended beyond individual aircraft performance. The Hellcat's dominance represented the intersection of American industrial capacity, systematic tactical innovation, and operational doctrine that Japanese forces could not match by mid-war. The United States had identified the Zero's strengths, developed tactics specifically designed to negate those strengths, built an aircraft capable of executing those tactics, and produced that aircraft in overwhelming numbers while simultaneously training thousands of pilots to employ it effectively. Japanese industry, meanwhile, attempted to develop improved fighters to counter the Hellcat. The Kawanishi N1KJ Shiden possessed performance characteristics closer to American fighters. The Mitsubishi J2M Raiden featured improved climb rate and speed, but these aircraft entered service in limited numbers and far too late to affect the war's trajectory. By late 1944, Japan's industrial capacity was collapsing under submarine blockade that strangled raw material imports and strategic bombing that destroyed production facilities. Aircraft production declined steadily. Fuel became critically scarce, forcing reductions in pilot training flight hours. The systematic advantages that had allowed the United States to develop and field the Hellcat were the same advantages that prevented Japan from fielding an effective response. Lieutenant Takeo Tanimizu survived the war, though his combat career effectively ended with the destruction of his Zero over Iwo Jima in February 1945. He ejected successfully one of the fortunate minority of Japanese pilots who survived aircraft loss and was subsequently assigned to training duties in Japan, teaching new pilots the harsh lessons he had learned. In his memoir, published in 1952, he reflected on the experience of June 19, 1944, with the perspective that survival and time had provided. We absolutely believed in the Zero. We believed in our training, in our tactics, in the superiority that early victories had seemingly confirmed. The Philippine Sea battle destroyed those beliefs with overwhelming evidence. The Americans did not attempt to fight us in turning engagements where we possessed advantage. They fought exclusively in vertical maneuvers, where they possessed decisive advantage. This tactical approach seems obvious in retrospect, but at the time, it felt as though the fundamental rules of aerial combat had been rewritten without warning. We continued fighting for another year, but we understood from that day forward that that we could not achieve air superiority against the Hellcat. The directive to never fight vertically against the F6F was accurate tactical advice, but it was also an admission that we had lost the capability to defeat American fighters in the combat that mattered. The technological gap was never closed. Japan lacked the industrial capacity, the raw materials, the fuel supplies, and increasingly the time necessary to develop and field aircraft that could match the Hellcat's capabilities. American production continued at levels Japanese planners had believed impossible. Grumman's Bethpage factory delivered 12,275 F6F Hellcats between 1942 and 1945. Peak production exceeded 600 aircraft monthly. This industrial capacity, combined with a pilot training infrastructure that graduated thousands of well-trained aviators annually, created a systematic advantage that tactical or technical innovations could not overcome. The story of the Hellcat versus the Zero ultimately transcends questions of which aircraft was better in some abstract engineering sense. The Zero was an exceptional aircraft for the war Japan had planned. Long-range strikes from carriers, achieving local air superiority through superior maneuverability, maximizing range and performance through weight reduction. The Hellcat was designed for the war that actually developed sustained operations from large carriers, absorbing battle damage, achieving air superiority through superior power and systematic tactical doctrine, winning through industrial production as much as through individual performance. The moment Japanese pilots watched Hellcats climb at 3,500 feet per minute, pulling away from pursuing Zeros with effortless superiority, was the moment they understood this fundamental reality. The tactical directive to never fight vertically against the F6F was not merely technical advice about aircraft performance envelopes. It was an acknowledgement that American industrial and technical capability had fundamentally changed the nature of Pacific air combat. Japanese pilots could follow that directive perfectly, could avoid vertical engagements with absolute discipline, and it would not change the strategic outcome. American pilots would maintain altitude advantage through superior climb performance and simply wait for opportunities. Eventually, every engagement would occur on American terms, in the vertical plane where Hellcat advantages were decisive. The broader historical lesson extends beyond specific aircraft types or individual battles. It illuminates how warfare evolves when one combatant can innovate tactically and support that innovation with overwhelming industrial production. The Zero represented Japanese thinking about air combat in 1941, an excellent fighter for the war they planned to fight. By mid-1944, the Americans had changed what air combat meant. They had built the aircraft to implement those changes, produced it in numbers Japan could not match, and trained their pilots to exploit the advantages systematically. Japanese pilots recognized this transformation, documented it in their reports with remarkable clarity, and continued fighting knowing their doctrine and equipment had become obsolete. The directive to never fight vertically against the firm Hellcat was followed as strictly as circumstances permitted, but avoiding unfavorable combat is possible only when you retain the initiative. By June 1944, Japan had lost the initiative in the Pacific Air War and would never regain it. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not an anomaly or a particularly bad day. It was the inevitable result when obsolescent tactics and equipment faced systematic superiority in doctrine, technology, and industrial capacity. The Hellcat's 3,500 feet per minute climb rate was merely a number in a technical manual. But to Japanese pilots who watched American fighters pull away vertically with ease, who found their own aircraft unable to follow, who received directives acknowledging they could not win the vertical fight to them, that number represented the collapse of everything they had been taught about air superiority. It represented the moment when belief confronted material reality, and material reality proved decisively superior. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.